Okay, so let us start from here, and hopefully you are going to complete the lecture on money supply today over here, and we can start with money demand. Okay, so this is basically what we have done in the last class, analyzing three monetary policy tool to control money supply from the reserve market perspective. We have explained this reserve demand curve negatively sloped when the interest rate is above interest rate on excess reserves, because when interest rate is above interest rate on excess reserves, higher the interest rate, um, your reserves holding has to go down, and because you're going to give more loans out to the market, that's the negatively sloped portion. And the horizontal part is basically when interest rate touches exactly at IER, uh, you'll actually hold infinite amount of excess reserves. So you're not going to give out any loans, you just give excess reserves out. The reserve supply curve vertical initially, then horizontal at ID. ID is the discount rate. This basically says when your interest rate is below ID, uh, you cannot borrow anything from the central bank, even if you need. So your entire reserves is basically the non-borrowed reserves denoted by NBR. And when your interest is exactly ID, you can actually uh, borrow infinite amount of reserves from the central bank. The intersection between this reserves demand and reserve supply is going to give you this equilibrium over here at point 1 with the equilibrium interest at IFF and the non-borrowed reserves NBR. This is basically what we have done. Just a second. So using this simple diagram, we have analyzed the impact of open market operation in the normal situation. The open market operation is basically the shift of the reserve supply curve from this blue line to this red line, and interest rate falls from IFF1 to IFF2. Fall in the interest rate obviously is associated with the rise in the money supply. Reserves rises, high powered money rises, money supply rises, and the supply of money rises, interest rate falls down. That's the normal situation. And this is basically the liquidity trap kind of situation. Here, open market operation has been conducted. Central bank purchase bond from the commercial bank. Reserve supply rises, high powered money rises, money supply rises, but ultimately there is no impact on interest rate. As a result, there is no impact on investment, no impact on output. So monetary policy is completely ineffective in this panel B. Monetary policy expansionary open market operation in panel A. This is something that we have explained. Second part will explain the second tool of this controlling money supply is required reserves, RR, and from the formula of money multiplier, we have seen what? Dashrath, Meena,
Yes, sir.
can you please tell me that when required reserves rises, what happens to money supply? How do you know that what happens to money supply? When required reserves rises, that means the stipulation from the central bank to commercial bank that you have to keep a more percentage of your deposit at reserves. That means a less percentage of deposit has to be given as loan. What happens to money supply?
Increase, sir.
Why?
Because bank gives less loan, people's the money supply.
Okay, if I need a quantifying analysis, suppose your uh, initially monetary base is 2, required reserves rises from 2.2 to zero point 0.5. To what extent money supply falls down? Absolutely mathematics. High powered money or monetary base is basically, let's say, 100. Your required reserves rises from 0.2 to 0.5. Tell me to what extent the money supply falls down. For simplicity, you can assume there is no currency deposit ratio, there is no excess reserves to deposit ratio. So CR equals to ER equals to 0. Initial monetary base is 100. Required reserves rises from 0.2 to 0.5. To what extent money supply falls? What's the mathematical formula?
So delta R upon RR plus,
Delta R upon RR.
plus R
Acha, if there is,
into 0. Yes.
and if there is CR equals to, let's say, 0.5 and ER equals to 0.5, currency deposit ratio is 0.5, excess reserves to deposit ratio is 0.5, required reserves rises from 0.2 to 0.5. High powered money is 100. What is the generalized formula?
C, C, CR plus 1 upon RR plus ER plus CR plus.
Okay, उसको क्या कहते हैं? What does this entire expression called? The 1 plus CR divided by CR plus ER plus RR. What does this entire expression called?
न्यू बोलते न्यू सर मनी मल्टीप्लायर
इसको मनी मल्टीप्लायर करते हैं. So money supply, money multiplier, or high powered money, how they are related?
M equal to न्यू into H.
M equals to mu into H. तो यही तो मैं जानना चाहता था. So when my required reserves rises, why money supply falls? Because my money multiplier falls, right?
Yes.
And this is exactly what you see over here. Graphically, this is what is happening. Required reserves rises means demand for reserves rises. When the demand for reserves rises, the reserves demand curve you see it shifts upward. There's a blue line, initially reserves demand curve. Horizontal part does not change at all. Reserves demand goes up when the required reserves rises. As a result, interest rate goes up, and a rise in interest rate is obviously associated with the decrease in the money supply. So required reserves rises, high money multiplier falls down, money supply falls down. दशरथ ये भी तुम मुझे बोलो that how do I know that when money supply falls down, the interest rate rises? ये मुझे कहाँ से मिलता है? ये अभी तक मैं पढ़ाया नहीं हूँ. You have to use your knowledge of macro 1 and macro 2 to give this answer. I will teach this more in detail. But till macro 1, macro 2 में पढ़े हो, वहां से बोलो. The required reserves rises. You correctly answered that my money supply falls down because my money multiplier has fallen down. But this particular diagram says that when required reserves rises, okay, reserves does not change, remain unchanged. So high powered money does not change. Required reserves rises means money multiplier falls down, money supply falls down. No doubt about it. This particular graph says that its interest rate also rises when money multiplier falls or money supply falls. Uh, how do we get it?
Yeah. LM करा सर.
एलएम कर्व से मिलता है। एलएम कर्व शिफ्ट किस तरफ करते हैं, नीचे या ऊपर? अगर मनी सप्लाई फॉल कर जाए तो एलएम कर्व किस तरफ शिफ्ट करेगा?
लेफ्ट।
Left, left, left. Very good, very good, very good. So this is basically required reserve. So this is also a tool through which money supply is controlled. First open market operation, then required reserves. Now, this is exactly I have explained over here what Dashrath also says. The rise in the required reserve, there is a required reserve rate shifts demand for reserves go up, interest rate rises, causes consumption and investment and income to fall down, because interest rate rises mean consumption falls, investment falls, as a result output falls. It keeps total reserves unchanged, so it's graphically absolutely seen. Required reserves rises, total reserves in the banking system does not change. High powered money remain unchanged, and fall in the output and the rise in the interest rate reduces. ये वाला मैं explain करूंगा. This is basically coming from LM curve, and that is why interest rate rises. Okay, so it is basically a contractionary monetary policy. A rise in the required reserves, the contractionary monetary policy is going to reduce money supply and increases interest rate. And as I explained, that we have already seen that when foreign exchange reserves rises, the money supply rises, and if money supply rises too much, which happened especially when the economy, Indian economy opens up in 1991-92, the huge influx of foreign exchange reserves causes money supply to go up excessively, and RBI does sterilization. That means RBI sells bond to commercial bank to reduce money supply, and we have done some numerical exercise of sterilization in the last class. But the rise in money supply was so much because RBI goes out of bond in 91-92, and then the next resort to RBI is basically increasing required reserves. So RBI increased required reserves to control money supply. And if you want to see the historical data of how much open market operation has been taken place, and to what extent the required reserve RBI has increased at that time, if you go to the publication of Handbook of Handbook of Indian Economy, Handbook of Statistics on Indian Economy. Yeah, this is exactly the name of the book, Handbook of Statistics on Indian Economy. It's a RBI publication, and if you see the historical data, it will be clear that there's a huge influx of foreign exchange reserves, huge increase in money supply. RBI sells bond, commercial bank, open market operation to RBI sells bond to control money supply. RBI sells bond to commercial bank, kind of sterilization, reduce money supply. RBI went out of bond due to that, and the next thing RBI did is basically the increase required reserves for that. An interesting thing RBI did, not only increasing required reserves, RBI also increased SLR, the statutory liquidity ratio. Uh, ये statutory liquidity ratio क्या है, कोई किसी को पता है? What is the statutory liquidity ratio? Anybody? Kamlesh Kumar Parewa? Kamlesh? Kamlesh?
So percentage of deposits a commercial bank has to maintain
No,
in the cash.
no, no, no. It is not the answer. Statutory liquidity ratio किसी को पता है? और नहीं, I think मुझे पता, कुछ को पता नहीं. It's basically bank can hold bonds. If you can remember the asset side of the bank, it has reserves, loans, and bond. There's a government bond and there's a non-government bond also. Statutory liquidity ratio is basically the percentage of total bond holding in government bond. Suppose statutory liquidity ratio is 50%, means 50% of the total bond holding of a commercial bank should be government bond. Okay, that is the thing. So RBI not only increased required reserves to reduce money supply, statutory liquidity ratio भी increase किया था, so that bank holds more and more government bonds and less loan is given. Okay, so that the less money gets created. So that's the thing. So first sterilization, second was increasing required reserves, alongside increasing required reserves, increasing SLR, so that more government bond is held in the balance sheet of the commercial bank. Ultimate purpose was to reduce money supply, initially with sterilization, then with this uh, required reserves and SLR. And the last was this one, change in डिस्काउंट रेट. ये मैं आऊंगा बाद में, but still एक मैं बोल के देता हूं that why open market operation is widely used almost regularly by the central bank, and why this second thing, that's changing required reserves, is not a quite widely used monetary policy tool. Is basically, the thing is, in open market operation central bank has a complete control over the volume. मैं कितना बॉन्ड सेल करूंगा, कितना बॉन्ड परचेज करूंगा, I have a complete control on that. It is flexible and precise. And third, it can be easily reversed and quickly implemented. These are the three reasons. तुम देखो, जब मैं open market operation पढ़ाया था through numerical exercises, I exactly know that if I want to reduce money supply by 50 unit, how many bond I have to sell, or if I want to increase money supply by 50 unit, how many bond I have to purchase. So exact number of bonds to be sold and to be purchased, I know that. So it is precise. This precision is the main thing. This open market operation is so popular. I can exactly control money supply by exactly controlling how many bond I should sell or purchase. But so I can exactly manipulate the high powered money. So if I want to reduce high powered money by 50%, I know how much bond I should reduce, or how much bond I should purchase or sell. But for required reserves, the interesting part is uh, it can create a cause of liquidity problem and increase uncertainty for the bank. So just like initially, for let's say, if you keep on increasing or decreasing a required reserve, let's say for each and every month, so banking system is completely do not know that how much reserves I should keep. Required reserve increase किया, ज़्यादा reserve रखा, then the next month I decrease required reserves, they're going to decrease total reserves. So it creates a lot of uncertainty in the banking system. So that is why open market operation is much more popular and widely used than required reserves. So both are monetary policy tools. So whenever you have to control money supply, first go for open market operation, because it is precise, it is flexible, and it can be easily reversed. So मुझे लगा कि money supply ज़्यादा decrease कर गया है, I want to increase it a little bit, थोड़ा सा bond मैं purchase कर लिया as a central bank. और मुझे लगा कि ज़्यादा increase कर गया है, I have to decrease it, थोड़ा bond मैं sell कर दिया as a central bank. So it can be easily reversed and quickly implemented. So that's the thing. And the third monetary policy tool is basically change in discount rate. This is the change in discount rate ineffective. This is the change in discount rate effective. It basically says that when your market clearing interest rate is below the discount rate, you keep on changing your discount rate. What happened? You see over here, the initial intersection between reserves demand and reserve supply at point 1. Now, central bank reduces its discount rate. Ultimately, the intersection point does not change. As a result, it has no impact on money supply on the entire economy. Nothing is going to change. So NBR does not change, high powered money does not change, money supply does not change. As a result, interest rate does not change. Interest rate does not change means investment does not change, output does not change. So no impact at all. Just like over here, you see that pura ulta ho raha hai. Open market operation ineffective when my interest rate is at the floor. Here I keep on increasing, keep on purchasing a bond from the market. It increases my monetary base by increasing reserves. High powered money rises, money supply rises, but interest rate does not change. So no change in interest rate means no change in investment and no change in outputs. It's completely ineffective monetary policy over here. When the open market operation is completely ineffective over here, when my interest rate is the floor. The opposite happen in this case. When my interest rate is basically at the middle, my this policy does not change, has no effect. This policy in the panel B is effective. That suppose my initial interest rate, market clearing interest rate is at point 1, where the market interest rate and the discount rate is identical. Now then I reduce interest rate, my discount rate a little bit. From RS1 to RS2, you see the equilibrium point shifts from 1 to interest rate falls down. And whenever my interest rate falls down, what happened? My investment rises, my output rises. I have an impact on this of this monetary policy on output. Another interesting part is over here. When the intersection is point 1, I have a non-borrowed reserves initially from 0 to NBR, and this extra BR1, the blue one, is my borrowed reserve. This is the amount I am borrowing from the central bank. When the interest rate falls further, my borrowing from the central bank rises further. Okay, that creates an increase in the high powered money and the money supply also. Okay, so the discount rate falls over here. When interest rate is at ID, I reduce ID, my market clearing interest rate falls, my borrowed reserves rises, my high powered money rises, my money supply rises. It's an expansionary monetary policy. You see, the expansionary monetary policy is always associated with the reduction of interest rate. You see, this is also an expansionary monetary policy. Open market operation is a expansionary monetary policy. I purchase, as a central bank, I purchase bond from the commercial bank. Expansionary monetary policy is associated with the reduction of interest rate. Reduction of interest rate increases investment, increases output. Same thing over here. This panel B is a expansionary monetary policy. My initial equilibrium reserves demand reserve supply at point 1, where I interest rate is exactly equal to discount rate. Then I reduce my discount rate. My reserve supply horizontal part actually shifts down. My reserves rises. I have a more borrowing now as a borrowed reserves. 0 to NBR is my non-borrowed reserves. When the equilibrium at point A, my borrowed reserves was BR1, the blue one. When my interest rate is IFF2 equals to ID2, my borrowed reserves rises. So high powered money rises, money supply rises. And since interest rate goes down, it increases investment and increases output. So this part is completely effective over here. But this change in discount rate policy to control money supply is completely ineffective when my interest rate is basically below ID. So you change your reserves discount rate over here. The horizontal part of your reserve supply curve shifts down, but ultimately there is no change in the intersection between reserves demand and reserve supply. Nothing is going to change. It's ineffective. Clear, Sriman?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Sriman, can you tell me that in this panel A, where my interest rate is basically below my ID, I have seen that you reduce your discount rate, it has no impact on the economy. In this situation, what kind of monetary policy the central bank should use?
Open market operations.
Open market operation. Required reserves भी कर सकता है, right?
Yes, sir.
So when this discount rate policy is completely ineffective in this situation, you see both required reserves policy and the open market operation policy as completely effective. So that's the thing. most of the situation, this is basically what we observe. Our market clearing interest rate is below ID most of the situation, and as a result, in most of the situation, people use first open market operation because it is precise and easily reversible. And when open market operation is over, I cannot do it anymore, I am out of bond, I go for changing required reserves. And this is the situation when my interest rate is always equals to ID, then this discount rate policy is useful. And this is the situation of expansionary policy. I reduce interest rate, I reduce my discount rate. Since my market clearing interest rate equals to discount rate, I reduce discount rate, it reduces my market clearing interest rate. I borrow more from the central bank because initially I have to keep 10% to central bank if I borrow from them. Now I have to give, let's say, 5% to central bank if I borrow from them. So my borrowed reserves rises. Total reserves is non-borrowed reserves plus borrowed reserves is the high powered money. So high powered money rises, money supply rises. So this is basically the three policy and the relative effectiveness, ineffectiveness of these three policies, and why different policies are actually taking place in different situation according to their benefits. Okay. Another interesting thing is this figure. This figure basically explains that IER is basically the floor, that interest rate on excess reserves is the floor of market interest rate, and the discount rate is basically the ceiling of market interest rate. So uh, generally central bank choose this ID and IER in such a way so that their targeted interest rate belongs to a particular band. Suppose my targeted interest rate is IFF star, and I allow, let's say, it should vary between plus minus 2%. So I choose my ID and IER accordingly. Discount rate and interest rate of excess reserves, I choose accordingly as a central bank. I know ID is the ceiling, IER is the floor, and if I choose them accordingly, I can exactly bind the movement of the market interest rate. So this is basically the figure. This is basically my initial equilibrium. Then my reserves demand falls down, it touches the horizontal portion, IER, reserves demand rises, it touches the vertical horizontal portion over here. It cannot go up ID, it cannot go below IER, the market interest rate. Intuitively, it is very interesting. Let's say who? Odrija?
Hello. Yes, sir.
Can you please tell me that intuitively, forget about this diagram. Intuitively, can you tell me the why my market interest rate cannot go above ID?
Market.
This federal fund rate is basically my market interest rate. It basically says ID is the ceiling, IER is the floor. That means it cannot go below IER, it cannot go below above ID. So you tell me that why it cannot go below IER, market interest rate? It is the interest rate basically, let's say bank charge on loans. This is the interest that bank earns by giving loans. This market interest rate, federal fund rate. This is the interest rate on loans, let's say. It basically says your loan rate cannot go below IER. What is the intuition? What is the economics behind it? Suppose your loan rate is 7%, IER is basically, let's say, 2%. Okay, it basically says your loan rate cannot go below 2%. लोन रेट समझ में आया है ना? अगर बैंक लोन देता है तो वहां से तो अर्निंग होता है ना बैंक का.
Yes, yes.
This is the interest that bank get. It basically says if your interest rate on excess reserves is IER, your loan rate cannot go below IER. What is the intuition? अच्छा लोन देके suppose your loan rate is 1%. That means if you give loan to a particular person, you will earn 1% interest.
Okay, sir.
And if you keep excess reserves, you earn 2% interest. तुम क्या करोगे?
Excess reserves फिर रख.
This is exactly the thing. मैं लोन नहीं दूंगा. If my loan rate is below IER, वो exist ही नहीं करेगा. Because whenever it try to go below IER, simply bank will keep entire reserves as excess reserves. Required
Yes.
reserves के बाहर जो reserves पड़ा रहेगा पूरा excess reserve में रख देगा. So that is why my loan rate will never go below IER. Right?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay. Second, why it cannot go above ID? This loan rate is also a interbank rate. That means तुम एक बैंक हो मैं एक बैंक हूं. मैं तुमसे अगर borrow करूं, suppose I have to give you something like 10%. But if I borrow from the central bank, I have to give something like 8%. तो मैं किससे borrow करूंगा as a bank?
Commercial banks के पास कोई नहीं जाएगा. It will be easier to borrow from the central.
It should be easy to borrow from the central bank. This is the intuition. अगर market interest rate IER के नीचे चले जाए, commercial bank will not give loans at all. They will keep excess reserves. So that prevents market interest rate to go below IER. What prevents market interest rate to go above ID? Because in that case, people will borrow from central bank.
Yes.
Fine. So that is why, and monetary policy makers or central bank realizes that. So that is why if their targeted interest rate is 5%, and if they want that it should vary between plus minus 2% or 5%, so it choose this ID and IER accordingly. Bind it. Okay, that is also a very interesting application of this IER and ID. As I said, for India is IER is 0 and IER was 0 before 2007, 2008 for US also. But when the market interest rate hits at 0, liquidity trap kind of situation, then realize, okay, oh my goodness, my economy is in recession. One of the major tool I use to stimulate my economy is to reduction of interest rate, to stimulate investment and output. But my interest, if my interest rate at 0, I cannot reduce it further. What should I do? Major problem. And also I have a liquidity crisis in the system. I have to encourage bank to hold more liquidity. They introduce some positive IER. It serves both the purpose. Since IER is the floor greater than 0, IFF cannot go below IER. How it solves liquidity problem? Bank is encouraged to hold excess reserves, and it solves the problem of liquidity. This is basically the situation. This is basically the situation. You see the movement of this interest rate for major central bank, Federal Reserves, Bank of England, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and you see the situation. Bank of Japan is the red line. You see that almost something like at 94, 99, 98, something around 99 onwards, interest rate of Japan is basically at 0. They have a liquidity trap kind of situation. And if you see the Bank of England, this purple line, see something like in 2007, 2009 at that time when this financial crisis hits, this subprime mortgage crisis hits, European Central Bank, same time, Bank of England, same time, something around 2009, 2010, liquidity trap kind of situation arises to all the banks, and Federal Reserves then they realize that they're actually out of the tool. It's a major tool to stimulate the economy. Economy is in recession, subprime mortgage crisis, and interest rate is at zero. I cannot stimulate the economy by reducing nominal interest rate. And economy is also going through a liquidity crisis. I have to solve both of them. And they realize if I introduce some positive interest rate on excess reserves, it will act as a floor on market interest rate. It prevents market interest rate to go to zero, and also it encourages commercial bank to hold reserves and creates and solves the problem of liquidity crisis problem. So that is why they introduce positive interest rate on excess reserves, Federal Reserve Bank, but for India it is still zero. IER is zero, so no encouragement to hold excess reserve of the commercial bank. Okay, so this is basically it. This is basically the lecture entirely that money supply, how money supply gets created from the deposit through the manipulation of the balance sheet of central bank of the commercial bank, and how monetary policy, the three major tools of monetary policy: open market operation, required reserve, discount window, their effectiveness, ineffectiveness, why one of the monetary policies most preferred than over the others. And also another important thing we have is sterilization. That's a new term we have seen, that if for any reason, let's say foreign exchange reserves influx, it increases reserves, high powered money supply. And if I want to reduce this, okay, what I do, I have to reverse it. What I do is basically I sell as a central bank bond to commercial bank. Okay, so my reserves falls, money supply falls. That's sterilization. Two major application we have seen is basically, one is economy opens up in India 1992, foreign exchange reserves influx, huge money supply rise, control, we have to control money supply. RBI went for a open market operation. RBI continuously sold bond to reduce money supply, sterilization. RBI went out of bond. Next step RBI did, increase required reserves and increase SLR. And another important thing is basically this, that this figure, this liquidity trap kind of situation is basically a reality, and to combat this reality, Federal Reserve Bank, they introduce interest rate on excess reserves. So this is basically a new chapter, because macro, I know that you have you only assume that the money supply is controlled by the central bank. Central bank increases money supply, central bank decreases money supply. As a result, LM shifts up and shifts down. But you do not know exactly how this money supply is controlled. But now, after this lecture, you know how the money supply is controlled. Through open market operation, required reserves, and discount rate. Money supply is basically money multiplier multiplied by high powered money. So when high powered money changes, money supply changes, or money multiplier changes, money supply changes. Required reserves changes money multiplier and changes money supply. Open market operation changes high powered money and changes money supply. But once you identify that this one of the policy, whether it is increases money supply or decreases money supply, fine. Then what is the impact on the economy, output, interest rate and everything? You go to ISLM. In fact, interest rate का impact यहाँ से भी तुम्हें मिलेगा. ये जो figures हम लोग देख रहे हैं, reserves demand, reserve supply वाला, interest rate movement वाला यहाँ से भी मिलता है और ISLM से भी मिलता है. पर रिजर्व्स डिमांड, रिजर्व सप्लाई, ये एनालिसिस आउटपुट के ऊपर इम्पैक्ट क्या होगा, इन्वेस्टमेंट के ऊपर इम्पैक्ट क्या होगा, कंजम्पशन के ऊपर इम्पैक्ट क्या होगा, ये एनालिसिस तुम रिजर्व्स डिमांड, रिजर्व सप्लाई से नहीं कर पाओगे. तुम्हें ISLM में जाना ही पड़ेगा. क्लियर? एनी क्वेश्चन? Any question from here? Eliza Roy, fine?
Yes, sir.
No problem, clear?
Yes, sir. Almost.
Okay. इंडिया का जो सेंट्रल बैंक है उसका नाम क्या है? What is the name of Central Bank of India? Eliza?
Sir, Reserve Bank.
Reserve Bank of India is a question or is answer?
No, sir, answer RBI.
RBI. Very good. अरे लविन टीटा रे, लविन ठीक ठाक है? नहीं है आई थिंक. साची जलोटे,
Yes, sir.
clear?
Yes, sir.
You was not there in the last class I think.
Yes, sir. I couldn't attend the second half of the class. I was in the starting but couldn't continue.
Okay, but whatever I taught till now, it is clear.
Yes, sir. Like, yeah, yes, sir. Like, I'll go through the book once, then
मैं
it
ये
will
नोट
be
भी
more
शेयर
clear
करूँ.
because. Oh, okay, sir.
So एक चीज हम लोग करते हैं, लास्ट थिंग साची करो, उसके बाद हम लोग नेक्स्ट स्लाइड पे जाएंगे. साची प्लीज अनम्यूट योरसेल्फ. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Suppose central bank purchase bond from the commercial bank. What happens to money supply?
Sir, if central bank
Purchase
purchases.
bond from the commercial bank.
Okay.
What happens to money supply?
So the money supply will increase.
Why? Because money
So
supply अगर
because
increase
the
करेगा तो either money multiplier increase करना पड़ेगा और high powered money increase करना पड़ेगा. यहाँ पे कौन सा वाला increase कर रहा है?
high power money.
High powered money increase कर रहा है. क्यों कर रहा है? High
So
powered money has
because
two
reserves.
components. Reserves is rising. Very good. So reserves
Yes.
rising, high powered money rising, money supply rising.
Yes, sir.
Fine. Money supply rising. If somebody asks you what is its impact on, let's say output, तुम कैसे analyze करोगे उसका? What tool you have to use? कौन सा वाला graphical tool तुम्हें use करना पड़ेगा?
Interest rate. Through interest rate, we can say that.
I know, but how do you analyze that?
So through LM curve.
Through ISLM analysis, right? So money supply rising, LM curve is moving rightward or leftward?
When
money supply rises, the LM curve is moving leftward or rightward?
it's moving. It's moving rightwards.
Okay, if it's moving rightward, what happens? Interest rate going down or going up?
Its interest rate will decrease.
Okay.
That will
If interest rate rise,
to,
if interest rate falls, what happens to private investment?
it increases.
If private investment increases, what happens to output?
Output increases.
Increases. Is it output demand or output supply? ISLM representing the demand side of the economy or the
It's
supply?
representing demand.
So it increases output demand.
Yes, sir.
Now, to match with this output demand, firm has to supply more output, right?
Yes, sir.
Then to supply more output, what firm has to do? Firm has to increase employment.
Yes, sir.
So employment also rises. If employment rises, unemployment falls, right?
Yes, sir.
If unemployment from the falls from the Phillips curve, inflation rises. So you see, money supply rises, inflation rises, nominal interest rate falls, output rises, private investment rises, unemployment falls down. Entire economy is covered.
Yes.
तो ये एनालिसिस जब करना पड़ेगा तुम्हें ISLM एग्रीगेट डिमांड एग्रीगेट सप्लाई में जाना ही पड़ेगा. और ये ISLM एग्रीगेट डिमांड एग्रीगेट सप्लाई मैं और मेरा जो स्टूडेंट है दोनों मिला के हम लोगों को 2 क्लास या 3 क्लास पढ़ाएंगे फिर से using some simple linear consumption and investment function graph उसका. उसके बाद some numerical exercises, सब मिला के फिर से ISLM करेंगे. एग्रीगेट डिमांड एग्रीगेट. अच्छा, कैन एनीबडी टेल मी ये ISLM से एग्रीगेट डिमांड वाला कर्व कहाँ कैसे डिराइव होता है? एनीबडी? How do we derive the aggregate demand curve of the economy from ISLM? At least मैं ये करवाऊंगा obviously, but still, since you have since you guys have gone through already through macro 1 and macro 2, somebody from MSc student, ISLM से aggregate demand curve कैसे मिलता है? What Sachi rightly pointed out that ISLM दोनों is basically they're representing the demand side of the economy, output demand. How do we get aggregate demand curve from ISLM? स्नेहा बोलोगे? स्नेहा?
Yes, I'm thinking about we solve
So
these
you have,
equations
you have
to
a you have a
get
IS curve,
equation.
you have a IS curve, you have a LM curve. ये दोनों से मुझे मिलता है एग्रीगेट डिमांड कर्व. एक छोटा सा एल्जेब्रिक मैनिपुलेशन करना पड़ता है, सिंपल वाला.
Yes, sir.
How do we get it? Remember, aggregate demand curve means in the vertical axis I am measuring price of the economy, and in the horizontal axis I am measuring output demand in the economy. Why?
So the different IS curves that we have, there is a proportionate increase in Y and decrease in P. So we consider it to be a unitary elastic demand curve.
No, not at all. Something सोचो कोनो यूनिट इलास्टिक इनफाइनाइट इलास्टिक ये सब है ही नहीं. एक सिंपल एल्जेब्रिक मैनिपुलेशन किया जाता है जहां से ISLM से मुझे एग्रीगेट डिमांड कर्व मिल जाता है. IS में क्या है? आउटपुट है, इंटरेस्ट रेट है. LM में क्या है? मानी मानी सप्लाई है M, प्राइस है P, आउटपुट है Y, इंटरेस्ट रेट है R. IS में क्या है? Y है, R है, गवर्नमेंट एक्सपेंडिचर है, टैक्सेशन है. LM में क्या है? मनी सप्लाई है M, प्राइस है P, उसके साथ क्या है? आउटपुट है Y और इंटरेस्ट रेट है R. ये दोनों इक्वेशन है, यहां से मुझे मिलता है एग्रीगेट डिमांड कर्व एक सिंपल एल्जेब्रिक मैनिपुलेशन करके.
Money demand, money supply equate.
मनी सप्लाई मनी डिमांड इक्वेट करके तो तुम्हें सिर्फ LM मिलता है.
Oh, yes, sir.
Hmm?
Yes, sir. Yes.
किसी को भी पता नहीं.
So quantity theory.
तो क्वांटिटी थ्योरी फ्योरी सब हो गया है. तुम्हें मनी डिमांड LM का ऑलरेडी तुम्हारे पास है. यू हैव ऑलरेडी इक्वेटेड मनी सप्लाई मनी डिमांड, जो मैं नेक्स्ट सेक्शन में करवाऊंगा, डिटेल में करवाऊंगा. डोंट वरी. बट स्टिल, सिंस यू गाइस हैव डन मैक्रो 1 मैक्रो 2 ऑलरेडी as a master's level student, actually this should not be repeated in monetary economics, because we should assume the ISLM has been properly done. Actually ISLM macro 1 में macro 2 में होता था, and till when Professor Mishra used to teach let's say public finance, he also gives a very good uh, brush up of this ISLM analysis. And that is why when students come to this monetary economics class, ये लोगों को पता रहता था. People was completely used to of it, how to do it. So I think यहाँ पे कुछ प्रॉब्लम है इस बैच में. So I'll do it, but still फिर से मैं बोल रहा हूँ, मैथमेटिकली सोचो, जस्ट मैथमेटिक्स से सोचो. There is a IS equation. It has two endogenous variable y and r. Exogenous variable में government expenditure taxation है. LM equation, there are two exogenous variable m and p और endogenous में है y and r. यहाँ से ये दोनों से मुझे y और p का रिलेशन चाहिए. कुछ एलिमिनेट करना पड़ता है यहाँ से. आई हैड टू एलिमिनेट वन ऑफ द वेरिएबल्स. बोलो बोलो.
सर आर
R
इंटरेस्ट रेट
तो ISLM से अगर मैं इंटरेस्ट रेट को एलिमिनेट कर दूं, एक से इंटरेस्ट रेट लेके दूसरे में जस्ट सब्स्टिट्यूट कर दूं, so what I'll get is basically aggregate demand curve that is going to give you a negative relationship between y and p. So that is why, and graphically if you want to see that there is a IS curve given and there is a LM curve and you keep on increasing or decreasing p. LM curve ऊपर जाएगा, LM curve नीचे आएगा, and accordingly your y can trace out the y's for different p. That's the graphical way of getting the aggregate demand curve. So IS curve है negatively sloped, LM curve है upward sloping. Suppose initial price level is P0, intersection से तुम्हें मिल गया initial output is Y0. Now you increase P. Okay, if you increase P from P0 to P1, your LM will shift leftward. Output will go down from Y0 to Y1. Similarly, if you decrease your P from P0 to let's say P2, your LM will shift down and your output will rise from Y0 to Y2. And again, you see you get a negative relationship between Y and P. That's the graphical way of getting aggregate demand curve. And the algebraic way of getting it basically from IS equation or LM equation किसी से भी एक से R लो और दूसरी equation में substitute कर दो. That means you're eliminating R from the system. What you get is basically an aggregate demand equation. If you do that, you will see that aggregate demand curve will shift up if your government expenditure rises. It shifts up when taxation falls down. It shifts up when your money supply rises. So this is the thing. When your money supply rises, your aggregate demand curve will shift up. Excess demand will create inflation and it's going to reduce your unemployment. ये थोड़ा सा रहना चाहिए आंखों के सामने. You have to visualize this entire thing. ISLM, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, ये visualization होना ही चाहिए. Okay, and as I said, always you have to see this, that here also I am increasing or decreasing money supply either through required reserves or open market operation. It also predicts, this particular graph also predicts a movement of interest rate. Does it really match with the prediction of ISLM? ये भी तुम्हें देखना पड़ेगा. Okay, so ISLM, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Economic student, हम लोग कहते थे अगर हमारे घर में आग भी लगा दो उसके बाद भी मुझे बोलो, दो चीज इकोनॉमिक स्टूडेंट बोल देगा. व्हाट इज द कॉपडॉगलस प्रोडक्ट, व्हाट इज द कॉपडॉगलस फंक्शन? Economic student will say very easily, and this ISLM, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, किसी भी हालत में पूछो, an economic student should be able to answer that. Okay, ठीक है. ISLM हम लोग करेंगे. Money supply हुआ, money demand next section, and then we will equate money supply, money demand, then ISLM come, and we will do some very simple linear IS curve and linear LM curve, and we will derive aggregate demand, and we will see that numerically that when G rises, T rises, M rises, what happens numerically. ये मैं करवाऊंगा, and especially this graphical analysis, that how this I shifts, LM shifts, two pathological cases, that this liquidity trap and this interest insensitivity of private investment, vertical IS. ये दोनों graphically especially my student will supplement. Okay, so this is it from this money supply. I will mail this note of money supply to you people. Then इसके बाद I have to go to this money demand. Okay, so this is demand for money, and this is something you guys are much more familiar with. और इसको थोड़ा सा डिटेल में हम लोग करेंगे. We will start with quantity theory of money, then we will go to this liquidity preference theorem of Keynes, and then our objective will be to go more detail about this particular thing, the transaction demand for money, the very first micro foundation of transaction demand for money, that why it positively depend on why. This Baumol-Tobin model we will do, and after that we're going to do this speculative demand for money, which is money demand negatively related with interest rate. Uska micro foundation we will do, and then we're going to get this. I'm not going to do this dynamic general equilibrium thing of Sidrowski. इसके बाद थोड़ा सा ये वाला signorage and hyperinflation, and Tobin model, I think his name is, इसको करेंगे हम लोग. And just a second, huh? Okay. So let us start with this money demand, something that is very familiar to you people. जहाँ पे we actually start with this very standard quantity theory of money that actually gives us the very simple money demand, and then the speculative part comes into picture. Acha. The equation number one. Acha. Somebody asked me questions about this money demand, money supply. Initially, couple of class ago, one girl student from my batch. कौन था मैं भूल गया. Sneha, are you or somebody else? Odrija or somebody else?
Yes, sir.
Hello. You asked question, right, Odrija?
That was the first class when I asked about the money.
Yes. Manisa. हाँ. So this is basically now, Odrija, ये quantity theory of money का जो equation तुम देख रहे हो, number one. Term wise, can you please tell me what does this P represent? मैं इसका intuition में आऊंगा, but you guys have already okay, you guys have seen this thing, MV equals to PY. This is basically your quantity theory of money. So can you please tell me what does this P represent here in this equation? Capital P.
Yes, it is the pricing, I mean
Price
the
level of the economy, which is
price level,
CPI.
yes.
What does this Y represent?
It is the income or the output.
Terminal income output means
Um,
from economic terminology use karo. It is GDP.
yes, sir.
It's nominal GDP or real GDP? Capital
It's the
Y.
real GDP.
Okay, so price multiplied by real GDP, the right hand side is nominal, right?
Nominal.
What does this V represent? Sorry, what does this M represent? Money supply or money demand?
M represents the money demands.
No, here is the thing. It is basically money supply. The right hand side of this equation, that represents money demand. If I divide it by V, that also a part of money demand. So this PY divided by V, ये वाला जो equation तुम देख रहे हो ना, 1 over
Yes, sir.
BPY, which is KPY. This right hand side KPY is basically representing your money demand. And when I'm equating money demand with equals to money supply, that represents the money market equilibrium. समझ में आ रहा है?
Yes, sir.
So you can actually say this KPY is basically your MD, and the M that I have written over here is basically your MS. At the equilibrium, MS equals to MD, so this MS equals to KPY. So for your entire macro, you guys have seen that M is rising, M is falling, that is money supply rising, money supply falling, but you really didn't have any idea how the money supply is rising, how the money supply is falling, right? Now, I think this first topic that we have covered, now you know. Open market operation, change in required reserves, and change in discount rate affects money supply, either through high powered money or through money multiplier. समझ में आ रहा है? Atrija, clear now?
Yes, sir. Yes.
So let me now start with this quantity theory of money. So it basically, the basic premise of this quantity theory of money was demand for money increases with the number of transactions. Demand for money increases with number of transaction, which is denoted by capital T over here, and number of transaction creates income. So capital T equals to capital Y. So if I substitute capital T equals to capital Y, I get MV equals to VY. That's the basic premise. So let me go to the intuition that how do I relate transaction and income? Okay. Suppose, Odrija, you have 50 rupees in your hand. Okay,
Yes.
so you sold your labor to labor market. You earn your labor income, let's say 50 rupees. And with this 50 rupees, let's say you have given it to Sneha and you purchase one pen. Fine.
Oh, yes.
So you get pen, Sneha get 50 rupees, right? So one
Yes.
transaction, and that 50 rupees is basically Sneha's income, right?
Yes.
So one transaction, one income got generated. Now let's say Sneha got this 50 rupees and he has given it to Sachi to get a book. So that 50 rupees transferred to Sachi, that is Sachi's income, with the second transaction through book. So two transaction, two income get generated. So number of transaction in the economy is the number of income is getting generated. So that is why I can write T equals to Y. Okay, fine. So I substitute over here. So ये जो 50 rupees मैं तुम्हें बोल रहा हूँ, that's the basically P into Y. That's the nominal income of the economy. And what is this velocity? तुम देखो, monetary authority initially has given 50 rupees to Odrija. When that 50 rupees got transferred to Sneha, it basically increases the income extra 50 to the economy. Now, when this 50 rupees is transferred from Sneha to Sachi, another 50 rupees. So 50 plus 50, 100 units of income get generated. Money supply वही है. 50 rupees money supply, central bank actually creates that money and given it to Odrija. Odrija purchased one pen from Sneha, given that 50 rupees to Sneha. So income generated 50 rupees through one transaction. When Sneha gives it to Sachi, income generated in the total economy 50 plus 50, 100 rupees through two transaction. देखो money supply 50 है. Sachi, let's say, has given it to, let's say, Harsh, that 50 rupees, and purchased, let's say, one bottle of water. कितना income generated हुआ? 50 plus 50 plus 50, 150 units of income got generated in the economy. कहाँ से? वो 50 rupees वाला जो मनी सप्लाई सेंट्रल बैंक क्रिएट किया था वहां से ही जनरेट हो रहा है. So the number of time, the amount of money which is created by the central bank denoted by M over here, the number of time it is changing hand, that is the velocity of money. And it's an identity. MV has to be equals to PY. So number of time transaction is taken place, that is the number of time income got generated. That is my real income over here. मैं यहाँ पे substitute किया. So right hand side becomes PY. Now the question is, what is V? Intuitively, वो 50 rupees सेंट्रल बैंक क्रिएट किया था, वो 50 rupees इतना इनकम इकोनॉमी में जनरेट कर रहा है just through changing hands. So number of time some amount of money is changing hand in the economy at a given period of time, that is basically the velocity of money. And this equation 1 is basically an identity, MV equals to PY. So in this case, the example, the numerical example that I have given, M was 50, V was 100. M was 50, V is 3. 3 into 50 is 150. The total unit P into Y is basically 150. Total nominal income that got generated in the economy by that 50 units of money created by central bank is 150. Only through changing hand. So 3 is the velocity of money. It's an identity. So quantity theory of money, MV equals to PY. And this is basically what you have actually seen. That's a very familiar equation to you, MV equals to PY. And that is the intuition of this equation. Some amount of money got created. each time that money is changing hand, it's creating some transaction and some amount of income. And each time the money is changing hand is called the velocity of money. So MV equals to PY. Numerical example, 50 units of money is created by the central bank. In an entire year, let's say that 50 units of money changes hand thrice. So 3 into 50, 150 unit of nominal income got generated. So PY is basically 150. MV equals to PY. Okay, so velocity is V equals to Py by M. Actually, from this equation, if I divide both sides by V, I get M equals to 1 over V Py or M equals to KPY. So this right hand side is basically my transaction demand for money. So this is the amount of money I demand for my transaction purpose. MD is the same amount of money central bank creates, MS. And that's the money market equilibrium. साची ठीक है?
Yes, sir.
अच्छा, एक आंसर तुम बोलो तो.
Yes,
Suppose V
sir.
remains 3. 3 transaction has
Okay.
taken place, velocity of money remains 3. And M is equals to 50. So 150 units of nominal income got created in the economy.
Yes, sir.
But suppose my real GDP is, let's say, 100.
Okay.
So M into V is 150. Real GDP is 100, that Y. Then what is my P?
1.5.
1.5. यहाँ पे देखो, ये जो लेफ्ट हैंड साइड है, if more amount of money is demanded than money supply, then the price rises. How? Now suppose my Y rises. Initially my Y बोला था 100. Suppose ये जो लेफ्ट हैंड साइड है 150 है. Y falls down from 100 to 50. What happens to my P?
It rises.
It rises. This more amount of money is basically chasing less amount of good. The more amount of money is chasing less amount of good. Initially Y मेरा 100 था, अभी 50 हो गया. Y is good and services, real GDP. If more amount of money is chasing less amount of good, the price rises. That is why when money supply rises, price rises. Money supply creates excess demand for goods and services. समझ में आ रहा है?
Yes, sir.
So anyway, ज़्यादा और भी समझ में आएगा. So this is basically the right hand side of this economy. This right hand side of this equation KPY, it is basically my demand for money for the transaction purpose only. यहाँ पे देखो only transaction हो रहा है. Only transaction is taken place. So I am demanding money in this quantity theory of money only for the transaction purpose. So the right hand side is basically my nominal money demand, my nominal transaction money demand. M is basically my nominal money supply. When MS equals to MD, that's my money market equilibrium. Okay, and the velocity of money is basically PY divided by M from this quantity theory of money. So when the smaller amount of money circulates faster, you see when M falls down, V rises. That means in the economy, suppose a small economy which has only 100 unit of money supply, it circulates faster. 100 रुपया जल्दी से spend हो सकता है. But in a big economy, when let's say 1 million rupees is created, spend करने में ज्यादा time लगता है. Hand change करने में ज्यादा time लगता है. So when M rises, velocity falls down. That's basically the simple equation. And The same equation in another form, dividing both sides by V, the right hand side representing by nominal money demand for the transaction purpose. And when this nominal money demand equated with the nominal money supply from the central bank, I get the money market equilibrium. And this is basically the classical view of money demand and money supply. Money supply created by central bank, and in the classical economy, money is only demanded from the transaction purpose, and the money demand is coming from here. Clear, Sneha?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Anubhav, Anand? Anubhav?
Yes, sir.
Clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And this is from where this macro money demand actually starts from. And if you see over here, what people have calculated is basically from 1915 to 2010, they have plotted velocity of money. So from US, so from this equation, consumer price index of US multiplied by real GDP of US, whole divided by money supply of US. And money supply has two measure, M1 and M2. So Py divided by M1, Py divided by M2 gives you this velocity. So this red line is basically the velocity associated with M2, and this blue line is the velocity associated with M1. What you see over here, in the short run, there's a considerable fluctuation in the velocity of money. But in the long run, the average is fairly constant. And that is why the assumption of the classical economy, classical is basically a long run economy. So that assumption, the constant velocity is supported by the data. The velocity of money in the long run is constant. Data shows that. But in the short run, there is a fluctuation. So that is why this is basically the figure that shows that the Keynesian analysis is basically a short run analysis. So one of the major thing Keynes introduced over here, he has to break this constant velocity assumption because data shows that the velocity in the short run fluctuates considerably. In the long run, it is constant. So in the long run, mv equals to vy, v equals to constant. It's supported by the data. But if you want to analyze a short run macro, you really cannot assume your velocity is constant because it is not supported by the data. And this is basically one important thing Keynes introduced. Just seeing this data, Keynes introduced that I cannot assume velocity constant in the short run. And what Keynes did is this. One second. This is what Keynes did. Velocity is a function of nominal interest rate I with V prime I positive. So when I rises, velocity rises, I falls, velocity falls. I can generate these fluctuations in velocity. And from simple quantity theory of money, I get the liquidity preference theory. M equals to Py divided by V. When V is constant, classical quantity theory of money. V is constant, supported by the data long run. Short run, data says there's a huge fluctuations. I cannot assume velocity constant in the short run. I have to introduce some fluctuations in the velocity. How Keynes introduced fluctuation in the velocity, short-run fluctuation, by simply assuming velocity is a positive function of nominal interest rate and V prime I positive. And you see over here, your money demand, if you consider this, money demands, this depends on Y positively, that's a transaction demand for money. Money demands depends on I negatively, that's a speculative demand for money. मुझे मिल गया है liquidity preference. Now, इसके बाद, after Keynes did this, then people started thinking about what could be the micro foundation of that. कहाँ से Y positive है, ये वाला जो assumption केन्स लिया है v prime I positive कहाँ से आ रहा है? You see, when if v prime I is negative, then then when I rises, my money demand is basically rises. Only when this v prime I is positive, my I rises, v falls, money demand falls. This speculative demand for money, negative relationship between I and money demand, only possible when v prime I is positive. Keynes didn't say that why he has assumed that. The next development of this money demand function is basically people started thinking about how do I get v prime I positive. But if I simply check the liquidity preference theory and this quantity theory of money, liquidity preference theory of Keynes coming directly from the quantity theory of money, just by assuming that the quantity theory of money is a classical long run. Data says, as we have shown, the velocity is fairly constant in the long run. I simply assume v is constant, mv equals to py, v constant. But the data also shows that there's a considerable fluctuation of velocity of money in the short run. And if I want to generate a short run money demand function, which is the purpose of the liquidity preference theorem, I really cannot assume v constant. I have to vary v over time. This Keynes exactly did. Keynes assume v is a positive function of I. When v becomes a positive function of I, this numerator of this equation, this right hand side, numerator says that my y rises, money demand rises, that's my transaction demand. And the denominator is basically my I rises, my v rises, my demand for money falls down. The right hand side falls down. Right hand side representing demand for money. My demand for money falls down. That's my speculative demand for money. So that is why Keynes got that money demand and interest rate has a negative relation simply by assuming this. But Keynes didn't have any micro foundation. That why did I assume that v prime I positive? And then all this theorem after this money demand functions that people actually started examining after this is basically to check where I am getting it from. ये v prime I positive मुझे कहाँ से मिल रहा है और ये हम लोग एक्सप्लोर करेंगे धीरे धीरे यहाँ पे we'll try to give a micro foundation of this liquidity preference theorem, which says money demand has two parts: transaction demand for money that basically depends on y positively, which is represented by the numerator of this right hand side of this equation, and it depends on money demand depends on negatively on interest rate I, which basically Keynes assume velocity depends on I positively, and we got this negative relation, the speculative demand for money. So right hand side, py divided by v is a function of I. Right hand side is the demand for money, which captures both transaction demand and speculative demand for money. Left hand side is the money supply, and this equation represents money market equilibrium. Clear? Faisal?
Yes, sir.
Any question?
No, sir, it's quite clear.
समझ में आ गया? So this
Yes, sir.
quantity theory of money and the liquidity preference theory of money, they are not independent of each other. एक से एक आता है. Only is just breaking the assumption V is not constant in the short run. जो डेटा मुझे बोलता है. ठीक है फैजल?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Very good, very good. देव अग्रवाल,
Yes, sir.
क्लियर?
Yes, sir.
तो यहाँ से हम लोग उसके बाद इसका माइक्रो फाउंडेशन में जाएंगे. ये जो राइट हैंड साइड वाला इक्वेशन मुझे मिला, द राइट हैंड साइड ऑफ दिस इक्वेशन रिप्रेजेंटिंग द डिमांड फॉर मनी which depends on y positively and I negatively, transaction demand and speculative demand, वो मुझे कहाँ से मिल रहा है? ये assumption क्यों लिया Keynes v prime I positive? Any question up to this? No question. Gazala Rushi Rian. Somriddhi Sinha, other department student.
Yes, sir.
समझ में आ रहा है?
Yes, sir.
ये ग्राफ समझ में आया ना समृद्धि? ये वाला जो ग्राफ मैं दिखाया, इज इट फाइन?
Yes, sir.
वेलोसिटी ऑफ मनी कैलकुलेट किया गया है इस इक्वेशन से, py divided by m. P is CPI, y is real GDP, m is basically two different measures of n they have taken, m1 and m2, and corresponding to this m1 and m2 they is called velocity, and it basically shows that velocity is constant over the time in the long run. So mv equals to py. Quantity theory of money is supported in the long run, but not in the short run because v fluctuates in the short run. And Keynes assumes v is a positive function of I. And in this quantity theory of money, when I replace constant v by v as a positive function of I get the liquidity preference theorem. Transaction demand for money depends on y positively. Speculative demand for money depends on I negatively. The right hand side of this equation. Sachi, fine?
Yes, sir.
देखो data आ गया. You like data, right?
Yes, sir.
So data आ गया. शिवम कुमार. शिवम कुमार नहीं है. तुषार खोकर नहीं है. वेदिका गुप्ता.
Yes, sir.
समझ में आ रहा है?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine. ठीक है. If you guys have no questions today, then we will start from here tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And
Sir, sir,
बोलो.
mentioned something liquidity trap while explaining money supply. Can you explain it once?
तो फिर से आएगा. एक और दो क्लास वेट कर जाओ. It's basically a situation when this this is basically this mathematically when this term this v prime I is infinity.
Okay, sir.
And we will see what happens. It's basically because it gives me my LM curve completely horizontal. And liquidity trap यहाँ पे भी तो मैं पढ़ाया था. यहाँ पे बोला तो मैं.
हाँ सर, मनी सप्लाई में बोले लास्ट स्लाइड में.
हाँ वो
बैंक्स
not
में.
only but not only last slide, तुम्हें पहले भी मैं बोला था, if you can remember. यहाँ पे भी मैं बोला था. Let's see if it is here. One second, I have to open it. Money supply वाला.
Yes.
Oh. हाँ ये वाला. This panel B. When this reserves demand and reserve supply is intersected, the horizontal part of reserves demand. Eliza,
Yes,
what
sir.
happens over here? You see, you conduct open market operation. Central bank purchase bond from the commercial bank. Money supply rises because high-powered money rises.
Yes,
But
sir.
ultimately, this intersection point changes from 1 to 2. Market clearing interest rate does not change. It is at its floor.
Yes, sir.
When interest rate is not changing, the private investment is not changing, output is not changing, and this monetary policy, this open market operation is completely ineffective. This is liquidity trap. When your interest rate is very low,
Okay, sir.
and this is exactly what I said when IER is zero, because 2007 2008 IER zero tha,
Hmm.
and that is why you see it hits the floor, zero.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
And that's basically the important analysis, that when interest rate hits zero, you see what happens when economy go to recession. And if you want to stimulate the economy, what central bank does basically, central bank reduces interest rate and increases money supply. Increase money supply means you demand more goods and services, ज़्यादा खरीदना चाहोगे, and your GDP will rise. This is the purpose. But in the process, the interest rate should go down, that stimulate investment and output. But if interest rate has a floor, you keep on increasing your money supply, interest rate तो उससे नीचे और नहीं जाएगा. Then what happen? You keep on increases money supply, interest rate remain unchanged.
Okay, sir. Got it.
Interest rate remain unchanged means investment भी change नहीं हुआ, output भी change नहीं हुआ. This is liquidity trap. और हम लोग ये और भी देखेंगे डिटेल में. I think tomorrow I have to go a little bit of this money demand. Then after that, I think 31st of January वाला जो होगा, वहां पे हम लोग थोड़ा सिंपल ISLM सब चालू करेंगे. ठीक है?
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Got it.
Okay. Okay, then if you guys do not have any questions anymore today, I'm going to end the lecture today over here. We'll meet again tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.